prior research projects also have some experiences, maybe also some challenges that you can, or that you had in some of your projects that you're willing to share with the group here. So this is now for those who would like to share their experiences regarding some challenges to collect equivalent data. I would like to invite those to come forward, maybe to write something into the chat or also to raise your hand. And I think I cannot see, there's someone in the chat. Maybe I can see that as well. Or is there a question?
Yes, there is a question. And the question is about the high-level concern, and is why people think that this type of research is necessary. Is it just about generalizability? How do you convey it in a compelling way? And that's sort of like, that's basically what the main question is about. Why do we care about cross-cultural research?
This is something I would like to open to the entire group, because I think here, I'm not a substantive researcher. I just would say you care because there are a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different mindsets, things that you just ignore if you focus on just one narrow framework. It's important to have in research, we are obliged to have this broad view in order to really study a dimension. That's one, like, to get started, to get the discussion started. Maybe someone else would like to add to this.
If anybody wants to raise your hand or put it in the chat, I think we have some people who are already putting some things in the chat here. I think we have one person, Thomas, raised his hand. Maybe I will ask you to unmute.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm not really sure this is a question about equivalence, but it's an issue that we've had, and maybe it's a general issue. So we've collected data, I think, in 30 countries, probably from about 300 people in each country, and they're all playing games online with each other. And there's so many problems. I mean, one of the problems is we collected at different universities, right? And so every university has its own sort of socioeconomic class and its own criteria for admissions and these kinds of things. So we've got 30 countries, but the students in some ways you could say are different from each other. They're speaking different languages. They're different socioeconomic groups. They know each other better, more or less well, because sometimes the participants in one group will be all from a psychology department, and another time they'll be just generally sampled from the population at the university. And yeah, so I don't really know if this is so much about equivalence. So maybe partly I'm asking you if you sort of spot, if you can sort of classify the equivalence problems in this particular situation. And if that's just, if you have a search image for that, I'm guessing, so you can just be like, yeah, there's problems with equivalence probably here, 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 and here.
So very spontaneously, I would say that definitely on the side of the methods, could be methods bias, because it was implemented differently across different labs, if I understand this correctly from your brief descriptions.
It's actually the same.
If it's, I don't know whether you have used different software for implementing these games. So already, if you have used different software, different ways of implementing games, kind of how things were visualized, or large text box, small text boxes, we know that all of this can have an effect. So that could be, for instance, a method bias. And maybe just one thing, I'm pretty sure, and I'm including myself here, all of us can talk about challenges, things that have, problems, things that were not as they should have been. I think the important thing is, if you are aware of these things, to be transparent in your research and also to talk about the limitations. And also to maybe also for your project, collect at the end, we recently talked about this at Jesus, to collect lessons learned, to also make this known, maybe to have this in a technical report, to share the experiences, so that maybe you in your own projects, but maybe also others who are implementing similar projects in the future can learn from this. This is now my very spontaneous reactions to this.
Okay, great. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there's another raised hand.
Yeah, there's another raised hand, and there's also a range of additional questions on the chat, including related to some of the bigger picture question that you posed to the group earlier, Dorothy. I don't know in which order you would prefer to take some. I think maybe if yeah, maybe we can take one more hand first, and then in the meantime we can distill whom we can pick from the chat.
Yeah. Otherwise, I could also imagine that I maybe after today, I look at the comments if we can somehow store the chat and maybe come back to as a kind of more summarizing answer to some of this tomorrow at the beginning of the second day, if I cannot now very quickly go through all of that.
That sounds good to me. So maybe we'll just take one. We'll take one question from Susan, and perhaps the person who also has her hand raised. But I will first say out loud what Susan wrote. So this is Susan from Turkey, who said that when dealing with construct bias, what is the best strategy when we have one construct that holds different meanings across two cultures? For example, I'm working on the topic of honor, and here I see other researchers working on this as well. Honor has different connotations in Turkey compared to the United States. When using the same scale with translations in both Turkish and English, even if the items are well translated, are we truly comparing the construct of honor across the two cultures, or are we measuring something else?
So I'm starting now with a spontaneous reactions, maybe because you mentioned there are other researchers working on this topic as well. I'm later going to talk about cognitive interviewing and web probing, two methods to collect additional qualitative data. And this additional qualitative data can certainly help you to better understand what you are measuring, whether you're measuring the same things. And I know that there has been some discussion on this. Once again, from Van de Vijver, often brought forward ethic. And sometimes a solution could be that you have a core of common items where you think you can ask these items in a comparable fashion across countries, and maybe you add additional items that are country specific or culture specific and that are needed for the construct as well. Of course, then you have to decide how to deal with this in the analyses, because there are similar and dissimilar items, but that could be one way to better capture a concept and at the same time to be also able to compare things. I can also maybe there is going to be a reading list as well. I have some publications from Van de Vijver in mind on this, ethic combination, and maybe this could be a way forward here as well.
Terrific. So maybe we can just take one more question. I think Cyan has been waiting for a while. I will unmute you, Cyan.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is a bit in a similar direction of this former one, but I'm also facing challenges. Like if I want to measure let's say behavior A, then I need to provide the definition of behavior A. Then it's very different across cultures, and it's already making like discrepancies about understanding such behavior, and maybe what we measure is not what we really wanted to measure. And for this, you think this qualitative survey should be anyway held first to see what this behavior means in each culture and then implement it to our main study. But then it's also kind of like not easy to have like common definition in such culture, considering like individual differences.
Can you just repeat this? So I understand that you are planning to also collect qualitative data, but this helps you already to understand what you're measuring. And then can you just repeat the final part about the definition? So based on the qualitative data, do you want to provide a definition of the behavior? So now you're unmuted. Sorry, I didn't get the final. I'm not allowed to unmute. Okay. So, okay. Maybe I can say one, and this is also going to be on the next slide. So it's a very nice question leading to the next topic. One of the important elements of, let's say, best practice when you implement a cross-cultural survey is to be in a cross-cultural team. So that you may be standing for culture A and you have colleagues standing for culture B, and that you can discuss things jointly. So it's not you on your own deciding for 5 different cultures, but that you have representatives from the other cultures. And together it's you it's a discussion. So I cannot give you a kind of universal solution for all the challenges that you're going to identify. It's a discussion between members from different linguistic and cultural groups. And you need to decide what is the joint definition that we can apply across different countries and cultures. What are the joint items that we can apply, and what are potential items that we have to adapt or have in a kind of country or culture specific manner? Maybe. Okay. So I think with this, I will later on look at the chat, try to distill or get out things. And thanks so much for this interactive element. I think that's important, and also that you bring in your experiences. I'm moving on. And let's see how I can move on. Okay, because now it's about cross-cultural design. This is when you develop your measurement instrument. A few slides for those of you maybe who have not done instrument design before in a very prototypical manner. So what are the different steps that you should implement? I know that always time constraints, etc., come in and you kind of shorten some of these steps. But ideally, you start with, you have your research questions, of course. You gather relevant theories, you review the literature, what is known, what are the gaps. You define, based on the literature, relevant concepts and indicators. You select a survey mode. I've put it now here in the 3rd position, but you can select it also right from the start. But a survey mode is important to once you start gathering and drafting survey questions, because some questions you cannot ask online or you cannot ask in a face-to-face interview. So mode then comes together with working on the actual survey questions. And then in an ideal world, you have a pretest, in some way qualitative and quantitative. Igor, you mentioned that as well for your different studies, that you have cognitive interviews planned as preparation for your studies. Based on the pretest that you have, the pretest is essentially a test among the target population. So it's not among, you want to see how they perceive your instruments. And based on the feedback, you possibly revise your instruments, and then you have the instrument that goes into the field. That's one way to look at questionnaire design. That's a different way with a figure. So on the left-hand side, you have all the kind of theory in the literature. You decide on the concepts, you define the concepts, you define the attributes, it's called here. In other disciplines, it's called indicators. And then it's the crucial step, and that's here in the middle. It's how you move on from the indicators to the questions. And that needs to work. And that is actually also something we, in our academic mind, we create great questions that we think are here, and they bridge the gap from the indicator or attribute to the question. But we really need to make sure that the respondents are going to understand it in our intended way. And I would like to show you an example. For instance, an example how you could move from the concept to the questionnaire item. First, you have the research question, that is, to what extent is the educational achievement of a child determined by the socioeconomic status of the parents? Actually, that's a research question that is often asked in sociology. The higher the socioeconomic status of the parents, the higher the educational achievement of a child is the hypothesis. So I'm coming from this, what do I want to know? And then in order to answer this hypothesis, and I need to define my indicators or attributes. You may call them differently in your field, but I have to see what do I have to measure in order to answer this. So here, for instance, in order to measure the socioeconomic status of the parents, in my theory, I need the income, I need the educational degree, the type of job and the living area. That's how I build my theory. And when it comes to the educational performance of a child, this is how I, in my research, measure this. It's the average grades, the type of school, and the degree. And that's still, I'm still on my kind of planning side, but now, of course, I have to operationalize it. And that's the big challenge. Here I have, in the end, I have to find ways to how to ask good questions to get at the parental income. It could be reported by the child or by the parents. I have to ask the right questions, or maybe have competency assessment tests or whatever to get at the average grades by the child or by the parents. And so this bridging between what I need to know, like level 3, my indicators, attributes, and how I ask for that, that is very important. And this is all we discuss and we talk about it during the whole question design phase. There are a couple of, let's say, rules of thumb when it comes to question design principles. And that is, we need simple language, we need commonly understood concepts, we need a manageable task. We cannot ask for 4 different things in one question, and we need to ask about information that is available. So this is, I always need to have my target population in mind. Of course, if I ask and develop a survey for social scientists, for psychologists, for, let's say, doctors, I have a different information level. I have different terminologies that I could use. If I have the general population in mind, which is at least often the case in the social science surveys, I need to really focus on the kind of language that I use. And there are, I think, 10 criteria for a good question by Krosnick and Presser. And these are actually from the survey methodology side to major authors on the topic of question design. So use specific and simple language. And I can already tell you a spoiler for tomorrow for translation. This is also something, especially if you work with translators who haven't worked on questionnaires before. Maybe they want to, often they introduce higher level language. So you have to tell them really it's important to be clear, that's my target population of all different educational levels. So it really needs to be simple. And this needs to be a very specific instruction also to translators. Ideally, my instrument measures only one dimension in one question, because otherwise it's called double-barreled, and maybe respondents don't know. Should I talk about my family or my friends? If both of them are in one question. The response options have to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive, so they should cover the different situations. It should yield a truthful and accurate answer. It should produce variability in response, because if I only get, let's say, a strongly degree for all respondents, the question doesn't really help me also to explain further behaviors. It should minimize social desirability. So that's also very important. How do I phrase questions that are about topics that could be sensitive topics? The question should minimize measurement error related to questionnaire design. And for us, of course, in the cross-cultural context, it should be comparable across languages, cultures, and subcultures. And especially also when I'm now adding for your project, Igor and colleagues, open-ended questions, also lessons learned from our web probing projects, it needs to be really clear what you want to get at, because there are no response options that tell respondents in which direction to go. and you only have this one wording, and then you get all the open-ended answers. And if the respondents misunderstood your open-ended question, then that's a pity. So also open-ended questions need to really lead, well, clearly worded and phrased. Now moving to the goals of cross-cultural questionnaire design. So now we are all in the context, we are in a cross-culture project, and we are developing a questionnaire, and that we want to, well, it's supposed to work across, let's say, 10 different countries and cultures. So we want to develop items that are relevant for all the cultures and that measure the intended concepts in a comparable way. We want to remove cultural particularities in such a way that the items are maximized for all the countries involved in a study. So they shouldn't be biased towards, like also in the kinds of wording towards one culture. Often, for instance, you hear in cross-national studies, and often they use English as a source. And if the source is heavily, let's say, UK idiomatic, uses a lot of idioms, that is going to produce problems later on for translation. So you need to find a way that also maximizes translatability. And idioms are also, doesn't mean that they can be translated. They are very often culturally kind of ingrained and have associations. So you have to look out for this. The items that you have in your questionnaire, they should be translated as smoothly as possible into other languages, and I will later talk about so-called translatability checks. And if you think that some items require adaptations in one way or the other, that some concepts require country-specific implementation, you as a development team can already, let's say, earmark that. So for instance, for item 5, we know that this requires adaptations because it's about a behavior that is culture specific. So already you integrate certain instructions in the questionnaire. This needs to be adapted later on by every country or culture. Or education is a typical question, for instance, that requires country-specific implementation. We have different complexibilities, and I mentioned that before, because if we measure, if we want to collect data across countries, we have differently shared knowledge, or there are differences in knowledge. Realities differ, and different issues are salient across countries. So what is salient and, let's say, important and debated and discussed in one country is maybe a taboo topic in the other country. So all of this we need to take into account. And this is on the right-hand side. This is a very nice example about how different realities, how realities differ and what that means, for instance, for questionnaire design. If I ask about alcohol consumption and just ask how many drinks containing alcohol do you have on a typical day when you're drinking, there are different sizes of glasses, like 200 milliliters or more, or a pint or whatever, that are typical across countries or cultures. And if I just say 3 beers and I get this answer across countries, I don't know what is actually behind that. How much alcohol is that? Is it 3 pints, or is it in the Cologne region where it's a kind of very tiny glass, the Kölsch, if you know about this? So you will have to find ways how to harmonize that. And if you are a researcher that is interested in this topic, actually the European Social Survey has found ways how to ask for this in country-specific manners, but later on harmonize that into one universal coding scheme once again. So here you can maybe also from the European Social Survey get some ideas how you could deal with difficult concepts and later on ask them in a country-specific manner and later on harmonize them. Yeah, so now we're coming to the more technical aspects. So I have question design, and I can have different approaches to question design. I can decide in my team to essentially ask the same question in all the countries. It's sometimes called ASQ approach, ask the same question approach. And if I have this approach, that essentially means that I assume that a good translation is going to work, which we know is not always the case. But my assumption is with this asking the same question approach that I can use the same indicator, the same wording across countries and cultures. I can also go for what is called ask a different question approach. And that means during questionnaire design, I decide that I need different degrees of adaptations, or even completely different country-specific questions. And often in a cross-cultural survey, there is a mixture between this. And once again, I'm coming back to the notion of emic and etic from psychology. That's exactly the same. But I'm not sure now what etic is in emic. But one is having one set of items asked everywhere, and the other one is having some sort of variation and country-specific or culture-specific items. But often, and also in order to ensure certain levels of statistical analyses, often we try to have the ask the same question approach, to have as many items the same, to measure the constructs in the same manner, to simply allow for the highest level of equivalence and then comparison of means or something like this. So you can also approach this question or the topic that I had on the last slides with the 3 terms: translation, adaptation, and harmonization. So if you essentially decide that all the countries can ask the same question, you will ask the countries to translate this question. I'm not talking about literal translation. This is about producing a good translation, but having the meaning from the source item, using the same indicator. Then adaptation is more that we, in one way or the other, introduce differences, because we need these differences for my country or culture. Example on the next slide. Harmonization, there are different definitions of that as well, but that's essentially, that often happens for education. I leave it to every country in a very structured way to ask for education levels of the respondents in a country-specific fashion, but I have a way to bridge that later on into a common coding scheme so that I once again at the end can compare the results. And in questionnaire design, you're often between these different levels. Showing you a couple of examples. So this is the first example is here you are on the level of translation. Most items from the European Social Survey, from the International Social Survey Program, they are in this level. A lot of countries work together towards producing this common source questionnaire. And then for most of these items, it's a translation. So for instance, tradition is important to him. He tries to follow the customs handed down by his religion or his family. So I'm going to ask countries to produce a good translation. The next one, and I'm going to ask for raised hands on this. This is from the medical sphere, the short form 36. It's a very often typically used questionnaire for measuring health status. The following items are about activities you might do during a typical day. Does your health now limit you in these activities? And then there's one option, it said, walking 1 block, several blocks. And now that's for you and whoever wants to raise your hand. What kind of issue do you see with the second item? If you have to translate, adapt, implement this instrument for your own culture or country. Hi, there is a hand.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. I think if I were to adapt or translate this into my culture, my question is, I wouldn't know how far the distance is for 1 block. And in my country, people usually don't walk that much. So even just to walk across 2 streets, they would prefer to drive rather than walk. So it's a culture here that we don't walk that often.
Okay, so that is very important 2 points. So once you raise questions about, does it really make sense to ask that question in general? And the second one is about this walking 1 block that simply doesn't exist. And that's actually what a lot of countries so this was developed for the United States. That's a kind of common notion, walking a block, several blocks. So all the countries who were supposed to translate/adapt this questionnaire, for themselves, they had to solve this issue. And in the line, what makes sense for their country or culture. So for you, maybe there's really the question, should we ask this? But I guess still having some information on kind of walking is important for this measurement instrument. But I can tell you for some languages, for instance, they said we don't have this block system, but it's more about 100 meters, or let's say 200 meters or whatever. So they adapted this. But you need actually for this to know what is the concept behind this? What do I want to measure in order to adapt it appropriately? But yeah, so be careful. And this is also a pointer, especially when you don't develop a cross-cultural instrument from scratch, or if you don't have a cross-cultural study that you are planning now with Igor and colleagues, but if you have instruments that you're taking from the literature, you really carefully have to review these instruments and have to check, can we translate in the sense of producing a good translation, or do we have to adapt? So of course I can translate into German. I will find let's say, literal translation for walking one block, but it doesn't make sense. So be aware that you will have to introduce adaptations in order to make these instruments work for your country and culture. Often these instruments are developed for just one country in mind. They have their own framework in mind. And then it's your task to not just linguistically, but also kind of from the whole social reality in your country to bring that over. And because of that, actually often in psychology and in the medical sciences, you have the term adaptation rather than translation for kind of transferring a measurement instrument in another culture. So often you have literature titles like publication titles, adaptation and validation of instrument XYZ. Just to show that people are aware that they have to change more than just the language in one way or the other. In the social sciences, when you are in these cross-national surveys, often these cross-national surveys are intentional by design right from the beginning, and they try to have countries produce a translation for most of the items. So I think that's the reason why we're often, where I'm working, more often speak about translation of instruments. Just this, I'm coming back to this topic of translation adaptation tomorrow as well. Moving on to the next slide. So you have a possibility to look at your question design by looking at, am I going to have items that can be translated or that need to be adapted, or maybe completely asked in a country-specific fashion. You can also ask yourself now, how do I get at my items? So what kind of items am I going to use for my study? So I've done all my literature research, so of course I can get a lot of ideas from this. I can also look at large-scale national, international social survey programs, or maybe studies that are out there. They typically have questionnaires in the source language and in all the translated languages available. So can I reuse items, which of course could help in the whole replication of things? I could replicate some concepts and see how do I measure this in relation to some other study? I could look for open access repositories. I could go to pre-testing databases. You will certainly have repositories in your discipline. There are a lot of published scales out there, published in the source language, possibly already in translation adaptation. So there's a whole kind of set of items that you could use. But you have to make the decision. Are these items suitable for my research questions? Do I have to adapt them in some way? Are they of good quality? So this is all your decision, but certainly it's a good thing not to start from scratch if there are already some ideas out there. But of course, you have to check whether it makes for your study and also for the cultures that you are particularly interested in. It may be that you take this as a starting point and then start modifying, adapting existing questions, and then the procedures that I'm showing you in the next slides can help. or maybe you decide all that is out there, it doesn't help me. It's also that I cannot modify existing questions. I need to develop items from scratch. And then it's important for these items that you develop from scratch that you observe the rules for good question construction and that you have a multicultural, multi-step development process. And what this multicultural, multi-step development process means, I would like to talk about on the next slides. So this is once again a different way to look at cross-culture question design. Now I'm not looking at the source, so where do I get my items from, but I'm looking at different levels of intercultural involvement. And there is a differentiation between 3 types of intercultural involvement. In the medical field, I think they are using more of these terms: sequential, parallel, and simultaneous. Sequential essentially means there is a small group of researchers, more or less monocultural. They develop a source questionnaire, finalize this, bang, send it off to translation, and that's it. In the end, and then there is a data collection, and this is how they collect cross-cultural data. This is, I would say, the early days of a lot of cross-cultural research. We should be here if we want to collect sound and comparable cross-cultural data. We should be here in one way or the other in the field of parallel questionnaire design. What does it mean? That on the way towards developing my measurement instrument, I should have different levels of intercultural input from the different countries, from the different cultures that are involved in my study. And with this different levels of intercultural input, I develop my source instrument, which gets then translated and adapted. And this parallel question design is actually best practice. And I'm showing you what it could mean. And then there's a thing, it's called simultaneous question development. I've never seen that in practice, but it's a way, sometimes when it's described in the literature, it's 2 countries or cultures. And they develop the items in the same, exactly the same time, and constantly have translations, back translations, retranslations to constantly go from one language to the other, compare what is can be asked. Once again, I've never seen that in practice. I think it's not really feasible for larger studies. So most of these also, let's say, Rolls-Royce studies from the social sciences, they are here in the field of parallel questionnaire design. The goals of parallel questionnaire design are what I said before, the goals of good questionnaire design in general. So the items that I develop, they are portable to all the cultures. They are suitable for measuring the intended concepts. They are clearly phrased and do not unnecessarily impede translations. We will always have translation challenges, but I should remove translation problems to the extent possible. If I have items that need to be adapted or in one way asked in a country-specific manner, I should earmark those items for this special dealings. And a questionnaire that comes from parallel development should have translation notes that give additional definitions for translators on the meaning of key concepts or of key terms that could otherwise be difficult for translation. How do I arrive at that? There are different levels of parallel development. So the first thing, and here, Igor, I can say here is a green sign off. You have a cross-intercultural design team. That's one of the main ways towards working towards an instrument that takes into account diverse mindsets, diverse languages. Yeah, so that you don't produce bias, but just focusing on one mindset and one theory and one understanding. If a project gets larger and larger, of course, it gets more complicated to involve everyone at every single step in discussions. Then often what happens, there are small key groups that already involve important different cultural groups or linguistic groups or different countries that are quite different on the dimension of interest. They together in small groups work on the instrument, and at regular intervals they share the draft with the entire group. and then the entire group can comment on this. So there are different modalities how you can cater for a small group or larger groups. There is a procedure that is called translatability assessment. There is translation notes that you can add to your instrument. There is qualitative and quantitative pretesting later on after the break, and documentation. So in intercultural design teams, what is important is you need to have some idea. It doesn't have to be defined, but what's the working language? How are we going to decide on the final items? Is it all democratic? Is it everyone can, who's going to make the final decisions? Is it top down or bottom up? Is it a small group having the lead? Is everyone working together? I think the more, let's say, larger these projects are, and if they're repeated at regular intervals, they have these working procedures. I think for smaller projects, it's something that is more implicit, but that it's implicit ways that you need to come to final decisions for your questionnaire. This is an example here linked on the slides for the International Social Survey Program. That's an international study on social science topics, family and work and environment and government, etc. And they have their working principles, but they have 40+ countries and they collect data every year and since the 80s. So they needed a structure to organize this. How are we going to have everyone involved and contribute, etc. Translatability checks. It's actually something that was not there at the beginning when cross-cultural studies started or when translation methodology became bigger in the 90s or so. This became an important topic, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, because the idea was when translation starts and then all the translation problems get identified, it's often too late because you cannot change the source instrument anymore if there are a lot of translations and you've got your tight schedules. So the idea of translatability checks, translatability assessments, are sometimes called, is to try to identify translation problems during the source question design and to find solutions. So you're going to have checks on a pre-final questionnaire that is still open for change. There are different really methods. Sometimes it's called translatability assessment that is implemented in large-scale OECD studies. They have, for new items, they have 3 to 5 linguists, different languages. They produce a quick and dirty translation, and because of their experience, they know, okay, this is a term, I don't know what it means. This is something that we don't have in our country. So the reason for this is actually that cross-cultural scholars have seen that once you sit down and produce a translation, try to produce a translation, then problems become apparent. Sometimes by just looking at the items, you think, wow, that's cool, it's all understandable. But once you really try to translate them, then problems come up. And that's the idea of these translatability checks. In the ESS, it's called advanced translations. They have team approaches to this, but the idea is always to uncover problems, for instance, ambiguities where countries think it's not feasible, we need adaptations, any cultural difficulties, and then what could be the outcome? The outcome could be that you in the end decide, oh, we have to delete the items altogether. There are so many problems, or we cannot ask this in different countries. Or we are going to reword it to make it clearer, to remove ambiguities. Or we say that the item as such, often in the English language, is fine. But here maybe we should add a translation note on the meaning of a particular term. What's the meaning of fair in the context of this item? What's the meaning of social activities in the context of this item? And by adding so-called translation notes, or sometimes it's called instructions, annotations, in some way fix the meaning for the translation teams so that all the translation teams know, okay, that's the meaning, what we need. And then, but of course, when you add translation notes at the same time, the source item, the master item, should be clear in itself. So the translation notes are not interview notes. They are notes for translation teams so that they kind of find the right meaning. I'm showing you an example. And this is also maybe for you as a question. To what extent do you generally feel that you have a sense of direction in your life? Please use this card where 0 is not at all and 10 is completely. This is from a draft item from the European Social Survey. This is a face-to-face interview, at least it was back then. Just imagine that you are doing a translatability assessment, a check now for your study, and you get this item as a draft item. And you've got now 2 minutes, you think about a translation in your language. And then do you have any questions? Do you have any challenges? That's a question now for you. I don't know. Is everyone fine with this item? Would you be able to translate that into your language? Would you have any questions?
One point in the chat is that from Colin Boothbat, who is saying that direction can have multiple meanings: purpose, career goals, fulfillment. What kind of directions? And other languages can have specific words for each of these.
Yeah.
And another similar one from Konstantinos, who said that in Greek, direction would be problematic. We should use the word purpose instead, which differs a bit than the initial term.
Yeah. Okay, so both of you are pointing in the right direction. Unintended pun. It's about sense of direction, not just about the word direction, but it's a kind of belonging together sense of direction. And there were countries for the ESS who did the translatability checks. So they produced a kind of quick and dirty translation to identify issues. And they actually asked pretty similar questions, what you just asked. And so just moving on to the next slide. So the team, so in the European Social Survey, it's a cross-cultural team. It's from different substantive experts, different methods experts. And they decided in the end to keep the wording as is, because they thought in the English, for English native speakers, it's understandable, it's understood. But they added a definition. And this is the footnote 48 that you see here. That's a kind of screenshot from the questionnaire, a feeling or an idea of how someone would like their life to be in the future. Now, of course, that doesn't explain the different levels of life. That was the first question by the first person. But it gives an idea of what we mean. And then it's up to the translation teams to put that, to have this meaning in mind, and then to find a wording that is appropriate for that concept. It could be that the translation note, maybe it's not still fulfilling all the needs, but just to show you how this kind of things work. And this is also, Igor, for your project. If you have very important terms or key terms, and then you think the English is fine, but it could still be problematic, or different country teams could possibly produce different meanings if they don't know more about it. It is important to produce such notes, and that's the kind of level later on for the different translation teams. And also showing you on the next side, that's another example using this card. How often do you meet socially with friends, relatives, or work colleagues? in British English, that's quite clear. It's socially, it's nothing on the societal level. It's kind of not official events. It's something, you know, with your friends. But if people translate literally, they could produce a translation that is more on the kind of public events if you translate socially literal into many languages. So they added a translation note here. Meet socially implies meet by choice rather than reasons for either work or pure duty. And actually, a lot of translations go in this direction. And also in the medical field, it's a big topic that instruments, when they get developed, that they get key definitions for concepts or key terms later on for comparable translations. That's another example from the International Social Survey Program. Here, actually there's an idiom. I think this is, there are more important things to do in life than protect the environment. As said before, ideally you shouldn't have too many idioms, but you can still have them. And here they just define this is an idiom, which means in British English that the person has higher priorities in life than environmentally friendly behavior. So this is about the translation notes. And the final part that I mentioned when I talked about parallel development is ideally everyone producing surveys and producing measurement instruments during the development phase, you should take note of the concepts that you measure. So what is my definition? What are my indicators? So that, like, let's say even 5 years later, if people ask you, so what did you measure? That you have these definitions and that you have an idea of why you were asking certain questions. And this should ideally happen during the questionnaire development. This is an example here and not much later, because then a lot of things are forgotten. And this is actually now, I would say, the final slide before a break of 10 minutes, particularly important when you develop a new instrument. These are colleagues also from cross-cultural psychology. It's a publication, a very nice publication from last year. They identified a lot of problems later on in translation adaptation of scales. And they said, okay, it's all about translation methods, but translation methods cannot solve everything. And in this paper, it's a kind of plea for developers to simply document what they are doing. This is about defining the concepts, etc., and also having what I just introduced, translation notes. So if you are already aware during source development that things can be kind of critical, define those for translations. Because otherwise, if other teams later on, 5 years later, 6 years later, want to translate and adapt your scale for use in another culture and ask you, what did you mean? And then it's difficult to remember. So it's better to have this documentation while developing your instrument. And this is something I can, Igor and colleagues, I think it's definitely worthwhile to look at this, to see whether also this journal, I don't know whether it's relevant for your particular field, but it's certainly a very worthwhile also this kind of move here from cross-cultural psychology. And with this, I'm also looking now at Maxime and Niker, but I would like to have a 10-minute break and then come back for a small exercise. Can also already tell you. So these are draft items from the project. And I would like to ask you in a sort of manner of translatability checks, translatability assessment, to look at these items. So you will have time once we come back to look at these, and then we just collect your ideas, your challenges, maybe also recommendations for the project team. That's what we're going to have after the break. And then we are going to delve into cognitive interviewing and web probing. So 2 pre-testing methods that gather qualitative data, additional qualitative data. So that's the plan. And I would suggest it's now, at least for me here in Mannheim, it's 5:30. So that we meet again at in 10 minutes. So 22, okay, 22. And for me, it's 22:05. For you, it's going to be a different time, 20, I don't know, 22, and then in the different time zones.
Okay, 10 minutes then.
Okay.
Excellent.
Oh, hello everyone who's back. Yeah, very good. I would suggest that you have now 5 minutes time to look at these draft items from the project. I don't know whether anyone from the project wants to fill in the larger group on once again what your thoughts are behind this. But please do some sort of translatability check for 5 minutes. Try to think about a translation, try to gather challenges, problems, questions that you may have. And then for the group, with the group, we can bring these together and discuss these jointly. So let's say 5 minutes time. And I don't know, Igor, Maxim, do you want to say anything about the background of these questions, or do you think they're self-explanatory?
I think it's self-explanatory. I mean, we want to figure out the hard challenges that people have, and we try to sample a wide range of those. Either the most important sort of challenges, difficult decisions, so to say, and those are hard, complex questions. I mean, how do you get at that? How do you ask that? How do you even translate the term challenge? And so that's what we'll be discussing. And those questions are try in a funnel way from bigger to more specific, get at some of the features of it in an open-ended fashion.
Okay, super, thank you. So 5 minutes for all of you, and then I'm going to ask everyone by your name. No, of course not. Just those who would like to share their thoughts. Very, very slowly. I know that I haven't give you a lot of time. Maybe you got stuck in the first part. I would just like now to ask for any feedback you may have, and of course, in particular, it's the group, this project group in particular, that has the right to have the first say on this. Any thoughts, any challenges? Or anything is fine. You could also say it like this.
Some impressions in the chat, quite a few.
I'm starting maybe with the last one. I think the term sense of self and personal identity will be challenging for translation, specifically in the context of Indian culture, where social identity takes a front seat in everyday life. So this is, I don't know whether you're involved in this project, but this we're coming now not about individual wording, but asking what makes sense from a cultural point of view. Are we measuring the same construct across the different cultures? Is it, can we operationalize it in the same manner? Also, I'm now very quickly scanning through the chat. It's a lot of information that someone noted the word significant. It can be interpreted in many different ways. And I had this on my list. Just imagine every single translation team making different choices, and then you will have different items. So this could be a way either you reword it or you think it's fine in the English. It's pretty clear for the English native speakers who are going to get this, but we want to add a note on significant. How can we define it in some way so that translation teams know what kind of intensity we have in mind? I think someone it was about conflict, difficult situation. So I think that is the entire notion. Challenging decision, challenging issue. So if you have like these different terms on purpose, I think it would be good in one way so that all those who are going to be involved in translation know what you mean, so that they also keep up this difference. Or could it make sense to have just challenging decision everywhere so that you have it consistently throughout? If you keep the different wordings, so once again, I think that's a matter of discussion later in the team. If translation teams translate challenging decisions and significant challenge, and then the continuous items talk about challenging issue. So there needs to be also linguistic flow. Does the translation that you choose for challenging issue, does it fit to what you have introduced before? So this is also something later, once you test the questionnaire in the flow, it's also a form of pre-testing. Does it make sense once I'm a real respondent and move from question to question? Let me quickly think about some other, but please, if anyone wants to raise their hand. You can still involve others. It's a matter also of what kind of thoughts you have as the question developers. What is challenging for you? I will later show you an example of cross-cultural cognitive pretesting on the term challenging, how challenging it is for translation. But if it's a key term, you need to discuss this. Can it be translated? Does it have the same meaning? Do I maybe have to define it in one way or the other so that all the respondents know what I'm thinking about? So it could be in the end that because of different translations, you trigger different situations, but that could be a bias. If the wording triggers different situations, then it's maybe not that the people think of different challenges, but it's just the wording that triggers something different. So you have to very carefully decide and pre-test, and I think that is what you have in mind, how people would understand such a term like challenging decisions. Issue, very nice a comment here on issue. Issue is such a frequently occurring term in the English language. What is issue? Is it a problem? Is it a general topic? Is that the intention? Consider in Spanish may mean a different thing. Maybe think about works better. So without, I think that quickly, I cannot go through all the chat comments now if you don't ask them in person. But you already see by having these feedback and people think about a translation, and there will be questions. So if you do such an exercise in your project team, and I think you've already started doing this, people asking about the meaning of challenging whatever, you will gather the kind of most problematic things, and that's the task for you. Should we reword this? Do we have to define things? Maybe do the translation questions help me to find better wording? They are using the word important instead of significant. Maybe that could be an option. So that's the kind of, let's say, meat that helps you to develop your questionnaire. Also, maybe I can tell you from a translation experiment that we had just the other days at GESES, a great deal. How much is a great deal? Because in German, we had a lot of translations because you cannot translate it. Often you cannot translate that literally. So you have to find, is it strong? Is it very strong? I wouldn't know from a great deal what this is. I think if you can have a question that is similar to how much do you believe this challenging issue changed your sense? Maybe a scale like that you had for the last item, not at all to very much, is maybe clearer and also more clearer for translation teams. Just that's quickly, I think you identified a lot of the challenges here. And with this, I would like to move on to the second part. And if I don't have any questions now in person, then I would like to start talking about cognitive interviewing and pretesting. Let me start with the goal of question pretesting. It actually refers to the evaluation of individual questions or of the whole questionnaire before it's used in the field. So before I do the real data collection. And the reasons for conducting a pretest is that I would like to evaluate the adequacy of questions and materials for the intended purposes, for my research purposes, but also for the intended population. I would like to identify and analyze sources of measurement error if they exist. Based on these pretesting methods, I would like to get recommendations for improvements. And that's particularly important for this project, for multilingual, multicultural projects. By having pretests in one way or the other, I would like to ensure validity and cross-cultural equivalence, so comparability of the data. And I would like to uncover problems with translated and adapted survey items if it's about your translation and not just about the general concept. There's a very nice definition by Gordon Willis. He's actually a big player when it comes to cognitive interviewing, and his literature is one of the major literature on, at least from survey methodology on cognitive interviewing. And he says that cross-cultural equivalence is whether the range of interpretations associated with the evaluated items varies acceptably between cultural or language groups, given the survey measurement objectives. And I highlighted here the terms varies acceptably because I think it's a very nice wording. We know there is no standardized meaning as such that is the same for everyone. This, even if I have a questionnaire in English, in French, in Spanish, in Arabic, and German, people will understand it differently, but we will need to have a kind of, let's say, a common core that is the same across cultures. And he just used the word varies acceptably. And that's what we want to assure by using also cognitive interviewing. Cognitive pretesting is especially important for cross-cultural surveys because it can identify different issues, different problems. So the meaning of issues now is problems. It can identify the lack of comparability. It can identify different interpretations that respondents in different countries and with different languages have with items. We can uncover different underlying knowledge that will sometimes impede the adequate responding to an item. We can identify different understanding based on translations, different uses of answer scales possibly, and the lack of construct overlap between source and target population. So if respondents think about different things when they get an item, one group of respondents with one language maybe only about family issues, and in the other language possibly only about, let's say, public political issues, at least the question is important to ask, could it be the wording, or is it a reality? There are different methods for testing survey questions, and I have now a list of different methods. I'm going to focus today on cognitive interviewing and web probing. But you could have a standard pretest or pilot study. It's called differently depending on project, depending on discipline. It's essential quantitative data collection before you go into the field. Sometimes it's also called a field test. You could have expert reviews. You could have behavior codings, you could have respondent debriefings. So you have a kind of prior data collection, and after the data collection, you ask, for instance, interviewers or respondents in this case, how did it all work? You could have focus groups, cognitive interviewing, eye tracking, which is of course a very comprehensive method, web probing, split ballot experiments where you have two wordings of an item and that go randomly to one group or the other group, and special experimental designs, MTMM. No more information on this, but this is all possible. But let's start with cognitive interviewing. Cognitive interviewing is, once again, a definition by colleagues Betty and Willis. It's the administration of draft survey questions while collecting additional verbal information about the survey responses. And this information is used to evaluate the quality of the response or to help determine whether the question is generating the information that its author intends. So by checking what is our measurement intention, our measurement goal, and kind of comparing this with the kind of output that we get from the respondents, we can see whether there is a match, which is fine. Okay, we can continue with this question, or we have to refine and optimize the question. Cognitive interviewing has three essential core elements. That is, we administer the survey questions. So we have a pretesting questionnaire, and the participants, our test persons, they answer these questions that should be tested. Then we have observations and think aloud. So there is a cognitive interviewer who observes any reactions during the question answering process and documents any problems if they show up at this point already. And then we have something that is a paradigm that is called probing. So the respondents or participant answers a question, and we as a cognitive interviewers have follow-up questions about the meaning of a question, about how the respondents arrived at their answers. And that is the material that we get in order to see whether our questions measure what they are supposed to measure. So with these, all of this information, we collect information on the understanding of words. We can probe and get information whether any recall in memory works correctly. Let's say if we ask a question about thinking back the last 3 years, how often did you go to the, I don't know, general practitioner? That could be hard for people to remember. So this is also something that we can get at. Difficulties remembering an event or how often persons did things. We can get at estimation strategies. So for instance, if we ask respondents, how often did you do the following things? And we could ask them, so how did you arrive at your answer? And we could see how they produced their answer of, I don't know, the times they went to the cinemas, to the theater, to the doctors, watching TV during a typical day, etc. And we can get information how comfortable they felt when answering. So this is also about checking, is this sensitive topics? Are they willing to talk about, to give an answer, maybe also in a face-to-face interview situation? And we can also get an idea, how confident are they in their response? Would they go for the same response again? Or is it kind of difficult to use our response scales? There are essentially two paradigms. One paradigm is the think aloud paradigm, and the other one, the probing one. Think aloud means that I ask my respondents, test persons, that during, like when answering my survey instrument, my survey questions, that they think aloud, so that they say whatever's in their mind, give us the answer, but then at the same time say, oh, I was thinking of this and this and this. This is definitely not a task that everyone can do. So this is something that you should keep in mind. I can only say at GESUS, we have a cognitive pretesting lab, and and a lot of labs, they are doing the probing paradigm, which essentially means that you ask targeted probing questions after the question that you want to learn more about, or maybe at the end of the interview. And the goal is really for specific questions, using our follow-up questions to learn more. What do I mean by probing questions? For instance, I could ask or be interested in kind of general probing question. I could ask what went through your mind when you asked when you were asked this question, or when you answered this question. So this is kind of, I'm interested in whatever. But of course, I need to have goals when I design the probes. I need to have a measurement intention as well. I'm just giving you now some examples that typically occur in cognitive interviewing. Comprehension probing is something that typically occurs. And that is particularly relevant as well for the cross-national context, because I want to see whether a term or a kind of concept has the same meaning across languages. Can you tell me in your own words what you think this question is asking? Or what does, I don't know, civil disobedience mean to you when answering this question? So this is something where you can identify different patterns. Category selection probing is something where you have respondents chosen answer from a response scale. And they said, for instance, rather agree, and then you ask them, why did they choose rather agree, or why did they choose strongly agree? And here you get at the different patterns that drive their decisions, and you can also identify different country-specific patterns. If you're more interested in how they arrived at their answer, you can ask, how do you remember that? What time period were you thinking of when answering? If you're more interested in confidence and how accurate you think or they think their answer is, you could ask, how accurate would you say your answer is? Or you could ask, and this is more very specific probing, is there a difference for you between the first and the last question, or do they mean the same thing? So if you, in a pretesting situation, want to test different wordings, for instance. So these are all probing examples that you could ask in a cognitive interviewing study. So some important dimensions. So in cognitive interviews, you have a one-on-one interview. So you have one cognitive interviewer and one test person. So it's not like a focus group. The focus group also could ask similar questions, but then it's larger like groups coming together, and then everyone in the same room, virtual or in person. There are no if you ask me about this is best practice, there are no clear fixed rules. The practice, how cognitive interviewing is implemented, varies by organizations. It can range from completely unstructured. So it's essentially up to the cognitive interviewers to ask questions where they think it's useful, and to ask a lot of spontaneous questions depending on the reactions. But you can have completely standardized interviewing. So you prepare everything in advance, you have your probes ready, and then you have cognitive interviewers. They may be, let's say, proficient and have experience with cognitive interviewing, but maybe not, but they have their kind of protocol and they can follow that. Especially if you want to implement that, and if your teams are not experienced with cognitive interviewing, it makes sense to have a quite standardized interviewing guide for all the teams to implement, so that they ask the same questions in all the countries to get the same information. There is no clear evidence of how many interviews should be conducted per pretest, but usually it's between 10 and 30. So it's qualitative. It's you just get an idea. It's not that it's totally representative. But it is important in order to kind of come closer as well to that there is a relation to the actual survey, that the respondents whom you invite for the cognitive interviews, that they resemble the respondents of the actual survey with regard to sex, age, education, or other important study-specific variables. So you should get a selection of the target population and invite those for, of course, not the same persons, but from the profile, and invite those for your cognitive interviewing study. And usually it is advisable to collect a pretest in the same mode as the data collection, because then you can also see are there any, like if we implement it face-to-face, are people willing to talk about topics? So if you test this in a web survey mode, you may not get right whether people are willing to talk about a topic in front of an interviewer. Or you could test also the way how you implement a question online may also have some repercussions and effects how respondents understand this. So try to have the pretest in the same mode as the real data collection later on. So usually what happens in these cognitive interviews, you have an interview protocol that guides the interviewers through the interview. It provides a summary of the measurement aims and the kind of issues that you want to explore. It provides space for the respondents' answers and for interviewer notes. And I'm showing you an example on the next slide. So it could be that the interviewer has like, this is the battery. Regarding your business, do you have the authority to hire or dismiss employees? Have employees generally have more than one client or customer? And here's some information on the construct. And here you have goals. What do you want to aim at when you do these cognitive interviews? So for instance, are items 9A and 9C understood in combination? Or do respondents with employees correctly answer yes to question 9C? So when setting up an interview protocol, you have ideas and you put these ideas into probing questions. So for instance, you have the probes here. What does authority mean to you in this question? So here we have authority in this item, have the authority to hire or to dismiss employees. And then the cognitive interviewers could ask this question. So this is how you could prepare kind of an interview protocol, and then interviewers know what kind of questions to ask and in which situations. It's important to understand that you can do cognitive interviewing at different stages of a process, cross-cultural development or translation process. So imagine, and that's at the moment, we are still at the stage of source instrument design. So we have an instrument that we develop, typically in the English language, but it could also be in French or another language. And at some point in time, we want to come here to a final version that then goes into translation. And this arrow here, this arrow means that I can implement cross-cultural cognitive interviewing to get feedback on the items and to have this feedback go back into the source questionnaire. So whatever I find, all the lessons learned, I can integrate that into further improvements of the source questionnaire. This means that if at this stage, I can still change the source questionnaire. You can also have pre-testing later on. Once you have kind of finalized the source questionnaire, you have all the translations, all the country teams doing the translations, and you can have pre-testing, cognitive interviewing, whatever, on these translations. And I'm going to introduce a model, translation model tomorrow that includes pre-testing of translations. But what you need to understand from a, let's say, workflow is, once you have reached the stage of having finalized a source questionnaire, having sent it out to translation teams, and this type of pre-testing can usually only help to improve the wording of translations. Even if country teams at this stage find a lot of concept problems, whatever, this is often too late to feed that back into the source questionnaire, which has already been finalized. So, and this is why I said you can have this cross-cultural pre-testing during questionnaire design, where you have the time and the means to integrate the feedback back into source development. So that is important to see at what time do I have pre-testing of my translations and what is the goal. Here, it's really to improve the source instrument for all cultures. And here, it's more about fine-tuning the wordings for the translations. Just imagine you have different wordings for challenging, for the word challenging. And here you can see, okay, you can decide as a translation team, we go for this wording, and you can see whether this wording works as intended. So this is the kind of final sign off for your translations. And then there's another type of pre-testing, which does not happen that often, but just imagine you have collected your final data. And then because of statistical analyses, because of feedback from respondents, from interviewers, you get a lot of information that something is, I don't know, is not really working as intended. And then you want to find out more about the data. And then you could add additional pre-testing that helps you to, you know, possibly to identify why there was a lot of non-response. But this is pre-testing that you can then use to improve the questionnaire for later rounds, because otherwise it's often not done at the end. Pre-testing is more done during source development for a cross-cultural study or to refine the translation as such. So just imagine, and in your team now, in your project, you are at the moment in the stage of developing the source questionnaire, and you want to implement pre-testing during the development phase. You want at some point in time, you have a pre-final source instrument and you want to test. So does this really work across the countries in your study? Then how could you move about at this stage? So of course, you need to have a time window where country teams can conduct cognitive interviewing, and you can use their feedback to integrate that back into the source instrument. So time-wise, you have to factor that in. Ideally, and that's always the wish list, you have all your country teams do a pre-test of your instrument. You could check the adequacy in all cultures, all the interpretations, possible sources of errors. But often you will have to make a selection of countries, of languages, because maybe it's not feasible in all the languages. And then you could ask who's available. Are certain languages and cultural backgrounds very important? Do they really cover the spread that are important for my dimension? And based on that, I could make a choice and select particular languages or countries. So if you have to make this choice, you can think about your research team. So who would be available to do the cognitive interviewing? Would I have people? Would I have trained cognitive interviewers? Could I train cognitive interviewers? Would I have people who speak all the different languages that I need? Or also the last point, is it important because of the dimension or construct of interest to have, let's say, countries who are completely different on this dimension, and to really have these large differences in the pretest to see whether the instruments works? So based on this, you could make decisions for your project, how you want to implement, whether you want to implement a smaller cross-cultural cognitive interviewing study. Then you have to ask, who am I going to select for participation in such a cognitive interviewing study? As said before, you have your target population of your future study, and you should take these social demographic characteristics into account and any important subgroups, and have them in your test person pool. In the US context, for instance, there's a lot of discussion, whom should I integrate into my cognitive interviewing studies? They translate a lot into Spanish, into various Asian languages. And then there is a question of, should I go for monolinguals who only speak Spanish or hardly any English? Or should I go for bilingual Spanish-English participants, for instance? And if you want really to assess whether the instrument works for completely monolinguals who don't speak another language, you should really go for, at least in the US context, for instance, for monolingual Hispanics to test the instrument in the Spanish. Because otherwise, if English respondents speak at the same time English and Spanish, they may understand some patterns of the items because of their knowledge of English, which you don't want. Other than that, this situation may not apply to this project. You want to have native speakers in the different languages of your project, who then will answer to your cognitive interviewing questions. The interviewer selection. So who is going to conduct these cognitive interviews? The big answer is this depends on the availability. And they should ideally speak the language, the source language. Your instrument is in English, and then the language, whatever, it's Spanish or it's Portuguese or it's Japanese, whatever language is involved. If they also speak English and not just the target language, they can later also get involved into the analyses. Ideally, you have people who are doing this, who have some experience in cognitive or qualitative interviewing, or who have some experience in questionnaire design, so that they have some are already exposed to the kind of challenges that apply to the method or to question design. If you don't have people who are not really experienced in these fields, training becomes a very important topic. In some countries or cultures, this is the last bullet point here. It may also be important to match cognitive interviewers and respondents. So maybe that only female cognitive interviewers interview female respondents. So this is something you have to see how this works in a cultural setting, whether there are some rules like this that need to be obeyed in certain cultural contexts. So if you imagine now you have in 5 country teams, you want to implement 5 comparative cognitive interviewing studies. How do you ensure consistency across these cognitive interviewing studies? Because the same comparability principle applies also to cross-cultural cognitive interviewing. You want to implement that in a comparable fashion so that the results that you can get, like the open-ended responses, are comparable and not driven by any methods effects. So the best thing that you can do is that you have written protocols so that you standardize the probes to the extent possible. So that all the interviewers in all the countries and languages ask the same question to the respondents. You try to have interviewer training for all the interviewers in the same manner, and they maybe have quality checks on first interviews in each language and culture, so that you in each country team know that it works the way how you've set it up. And these are actually questions when we have our additional meetings in November with my colleague Trisha Hadler. So she's an expert in cognitive interviewing and also cross-cultural interviewing. So if you have questions between now and then, when we have these additional meetings, she will be able to tell you a lot from the practical point of view for these, how to conduct these cognitive interviews. Cognitive interviewer training is very important to keep the whole exercise comparable across country sites. So what could this training involve? It involves introduction to the project so that all the cognitive interviewers know, so what's the goal of this exercise? Then it's a training on the cognitive interviewing methodology, especially if maybe there are students from your university labs, or maybe they don't know anything about pretesting methods or probing techniques. So you have to tell them what this is about and what the probings are aiming at. So this is telling them what are the details of the nuts and bolts of the methodology. Then it's about fieldwork. You have, if every country needs to recruit respondents in you have to tell them how to recruit respondents, whom to recruit. You have to tell them later on how to take notes, so that like in every country site, the cognitive interviewers are doing the same way. And in such an interviewer training, you should ideally have practice sessions. So there should be one person having the control of everything, having set up the guidelines, doing the training, and then also kind of monitoring practice sessions. And then in the end, you also need to tell cognitive interviewers what to take note of, what kind of feedback they should get, like if they are supposed to take notes besides recordings. So there are a couple of dimensions that you need to cover in interviewer training. When it comes to cross-cultural cognitive interviewing, you need also have certain decisions for data analysis. Because now imagine you have the cognitive interviewing in Spanish, in Japanese, in Portuguese, and in English. So how do you bring all of this in different languages together? So you need to make decisions. How are you going to analyze the data? Should, for instance, interviews be transcribed? And often artificial intelligence can help as well. But should it later on, all these transcriptions be translated into a common project language, like let's say English, so that the entire research teams can, based on the English answers, analyze the answers? Or should, for instance, only summaries from each respondent get translated into a common language? This is a way you have to decide how you want to analyze this data later on. In a group as a whole, then you need to ensure that everyone gets the answers or summary of answers in a common project language. Or do you have instructions to all the country teams how to analyze the data in their languages? So this is a matter of discussion. Normally, there's a way for cognitive interviewers to tackle the analysis. So they start with individual descriptions. That's the kind of, you have the raw data, and then you have the respondent data. That's the highest level. You describe how and why the respondent answered each survey question the way they did. So you look at themes or errors. And then from the respondent, you get across respondents and try to find common themes and patterns of interpretation. And maybe you develop a coding scheme that you can then apply across all the respondents. So what kind of themes did all my respondents think about when they heard the term civil disobedience? And then you can apply the coding scheme across all countries or languages. And then there could be a pattern of errors or interpretations across subgroups. So you can analyze the data from different levels, but you don't want to get stuck at the individual respondents. Even though this is only a qualitative group, you will still want to look at patterns that you identify. And for this, you need to move from the individual to the layer, like comparing all the respondents. And then, of course, the same across countries or languages. Once again, this is now very theoretical. Very practical questions. Do put them down for my colleague once you meet her for the face-to-face cognitive interviewing session. What studies do to manage all this data from cross-cultural cognitive interviewing, and especially if they want to learn what kind of things should we change based on the results that we get. They have developed coding schemes. And this is a coding scheme that differentiates between poor source question, so defined as all or part of the source question has been poorly designed, resulting in measurement error. So that is actually the message, throw away. If the source question is already poor, the translations cannot solve it. Then they have translation problems. So we could have cognitive interviewing responses that identify a translation error. So this is more about this can be solved in the translation. We could also have translation problems resulting from source question design because it's really untranslatable. Then we likely have to go back to the source. Or we could have identify issues of cultural portability. Based on the answers, we see a lot of non-response, a lot of unclear responses in some countries. Maybe the concept does not exist in all the countries or not the same manner. And based on this, then we have to go back to different stages of the question design process. So for instance, for poor source question design, there was an item like this. Using this card, if you add up the income from all sources, which letter describes your household's total net income? And they just noted it was not enough. It was unclear. What are all the sources? Respondents didn't know what from all sources meant. So they said that they have to revise the source wording altogether. This is an example of a translation problem, actually a very horrible translation problem, which should not happen because data collection is too expensive for these problems. There was an item that included in some wording, be wealthy. So should immigrants who are wealthy, and then it went on. And instead of wealthy, apparently the translator had read healthy, and they translated it into French, être en bonne santé, so in the meaning of healthy. And of course, this is something completely different, and that also got uncovered in these cognitive interviews. So the respondents were thinking about completely different things, and then they noted this kind of mistranslation. Once again, these things idly should have identified in prior translation procedures before the cognitive interview. Then a translation problem resulting from poor source question design. Here was an item, and that had a response scale that was going from all, almost all, most, some, a few, and no. I can't remember the item, I'm sorry. But in English, some and a few, that was really problematic. So what's the difference? How can we make this kind of distinctions? Because for these scales, you want to try to keep the intensity of all the kind of response options. You want to have the same intensity than in the source. But that's really was really tricky for a lot of translations. And I think in the end, they ended up using a different response scale. So this could also be an issue that you identify in probing, that respondents could be asked about how difficult was it for you to go for this response option or another, and then they get these cognitive interviewers get these results. And then finally, an example for issues of cultural portability. Asking questions about a general practitioner caused problems since the concept did not exist in the same way in all countries. So once again, this is something of, if we come from our own mindset and think things exist everywhere, and that is the exciting as well and enriching part. No, we structure our society in different ways. And this is what you learn from cognitive interviews and you could have uncovered it as well in like if people from all cultures and countries contribute to question development. But I think this was not the case here. So they uncovered it during cognitive interviewing. And this is now, you had this example of the term challenging. And I found an example from cross-cultural cognitive interviewing once again, from the European Social Survey. They had a module on well-being. And they tested some of their draft items in cross-cultural cognitive interviewing. And they asked, to what extent do you do things that you find interesting or challenging? Please choose your answer from this card, where 0 is not at all and 6 is a great deal. And here, actually, you also find the entire report, also on the cognitive interviewing study, how they did it. This can give you some ideas if you want to implement it in the same manner in your project. And I'm going to show you the results. And actually, they structured the findings according to the criteria that I just showed you. Poor source question design was one of the error categories. And then the finding in the report is the term challenging is used inconsistently by respondents. There is variation in whether respondents refer to challenging in the sense of difficult things that give a sense of satisfaction or sense of achievement, or in the sense of a negative difficulty, barriers to doing things they find interesting. There were respondents who referred to things that they used to, but no longer do, or do things that they would like to do rather than what they currently do, but that's a different matter. So you see, at least in the context of this very specific item, there was a problem of what is the meaning of a challenging. Maybe across all the different languages, if you have respondents that think about positive and negative things, and you have the same distribution across all languages, you could still have it comparable and it could work. But just imagine if you find wordings for some language where the associations that respondents have is more in the kind of, things that give a sense of satisfaction or a sense of achievement. And in other languages, the translation that you choose triggers more the kind of negative difficulty. Then I would say you would have a problem, because then you would get different situations, but because you have different wordings and not because, there are generally different situations in the different countries. They had translation problems as well. So in particular for the Portuguese language, Portugal was involved in this cross-cultural cognitive pretesting. And they said in the report, there is evidence that challenging is difficult to translate in Portuguese in a way that avoids negative connotations for some respondents. Once again, if you find in a pretest that you have respondents who think about both and in all the languages, that maybe is fine. But if you have a bias, that could be problematic for your study. And then you have a clear-cut translation problem as well. For instance, here, Israel, once again, was a country as well. In Israel, it appears the question was translated to refer to interesting and challenging. So this tiny word or, they combined it using and. So of course, that brings a different combination of things that restricts like the item in the, I don't know whether it was in Hebrew or Russian or Arabic. So Israel translates into 3 languages. So just showing you what you can uncover by the kind of feedback that you get from these cognitive interviewing data. So there are some lessons learned for cross-cultural cognitive interviewing. It is when you think about the probes, if you have on the local sites or in the different countries where you are implementing cognitive interviewing studies, if you have experienced interviewers, experienced cognitive interviewers can also do flexible probing. They are experienced in doing that. But if you have less experienced interviewers, it's better to standardize probes. So to really prepare everything in advance, the kind of probes that you want to ask so that cognitive interviewers can read that out and you have it consistent across your local sites. Our cognitive interviewers here from the lab, they see that if you compare cross-cultural cognitive interviewing to national cognitive interviewing, it just involves more parties, it makes it more challenging, and you also need more time to prepare the kind of training materials to be ready for questions. So it's important to allocate resources to that if you set up such a study to really prepare materials for such a cross-cultural context to train cognitive interviewers across sites. Of course, if you conduct cross-cultural cognitive interviewing, you conduct more interviews than in monolingual studies, because on all local sites, you will have 10 to 30 interviews. So not together across all the languages, 1 to 30 cognitive interviews, but this case number, even if it is small, applies to every language that you want to test. And the ideal part when it comes to analyzing the cognitive interviewing data is to involve the different country teams in analyzing the data so that you don't misrepresent any of the findings from country teams. This is now for cognitive interviewing. You can ask questions on this now. I'm not sure, because I'm not an expert on this field, whether I can answer them now. Once again, for the project, there will be additional follow-up sessions on this, but I would still like to give the opportunity to ask questions, or if you have already implemented cognitive interviewing yourself, maybe you would also like to share experiences with a group. So I give you a bit of time for this. And then I will finish with what we call web probing, which is a way to implement this kind of probing in web surveys. And that's the kind of final topic of today. But first, any thoughts, any questions from you?
There are 3 questions in the chat, 2 from Nick and 1 from Niyati. I can read them aloud, or you can just follow.
Do you recommend quantitative analysis of the transcripts, computational corpus, natural language processing, quantify patterns? So for cognitive interviewing, you will have very small case numbers, let's say 10 by language, but it will nevertheless make sense to have like a small coding scheme. So 7 people understood it in this correct manner, 3 people understood it in, I don't know, in the wrong way. So even if this is very small, it will definitely make sense. I don't know how much computational corpus linguistics can do with very small material. When it comes to web probing, this is the next topic. This is definitely something where I recommend to quantify what you do, like to develop coding schemes. And I'm pretty sure that AI is, there are testings, AI is going to be involved in this as well. But here it makes sense. The larger the number is of test persons for the kind of pretesting studies, definitely do some quantitative analysis of what you find. I do wonder if we suppose we find from cognitive interviewing that in different cultures, the same construct is different, behaviors are different. Would we design multiple different questionnaires tailored to each culture? Or would you try to create one that accommodates them all in the best way possible? What would be the best course of method be here? So I would assume that if you're together in a group of cross-cultural researchers, that you would still try to want to compare things. So you need to have some a structure that you compare, and that is often items. So what actually often happens that you get more abstract in order to accommodate different realities. And of course, the more countries and the more cultures you have, the more abstract you get to cover all the different realities. And then it's a matter of, for you as a researchers, so even if our items get more abstract, do we still measure what we intend to measure? But then there's still the possibility to have both, to try to find items that fit, kind of universal items. And then if you see there are clearly different dimensions across my countries, but they are very peculiar for one language or for one culture, to add this as additional country-specific items. And I'm going to add literature to the reference list on this kind of combined EMIC-EDIC approach. But it's certainly a matter of, in your research group, a discussion, can we find universal items? It's also, you can get some, do get inspired from prior research, from prior cross-country research on the topic. What kind of, how did they try to attempt bridging the different country realities? Could they come up with the same set of items? So this is also trying, you know, to find ways to develop instruments. I'm wondering whether I can have bilingual participants to check the consistency of the surveys in different languages in cognitive interviewing. This is a question. So here, of course, you need to make sure that they have, if they are completely bilingual, that they have a good understanding of both languages. And then you can, like the comparability, I could imagine that you can check the comparability of items, let's say in Chinese and English, but you may not identify whether someone who only speaks Chinese and not English, and you have produced a translation of Chinese, you may not identify whether someone who only speaks Chinese really understands the items. So you have to decide what's the main goal of your cognitive interviewing study. It's and why are you doing this cognitive interviewing study? And I think based on this, you also have then to go for to choose the participants. Normally, if we have our cross-national survey studies, we want to see, we translate into German. For instance, in our case, we invite German native speakers to see whether they understand these items. If it's a migration study in Germany, and we have the questionnaire in German and in English, because we assume that the migrants speak either German or English well enough, then I would invite migrants from different, like with different English and German levels, and see whether they understand either our German or our English questionnaire. I think that's it now. I don't see any hands raised. And I would like to conclude with web probing and then finish the day for today. Web probing is actually something that we started here at GASES, and I was also involved in the first project. It was a research project developing and testing the method, but it was not my idea. So it was Michael Brown who was originally behind this. The idea is that we take the probing techniques from cognitive interviewing and implement them in web surveys. But it sounds now easy. Oh, yes, I can quickly implement everything in web surveys, but we should still ensure that these web probing studies need to be carefully designed. There are a lot of choices that you can make to ensure higher response quality. So the goal with web probing is essentially the same compared to cognitive interviewing. We want to get at respondents' cognitive processes when they answer a survey question. And based on these answers that we get, we want to assess the quality of our survey questions. We want to see whether our questions measure the same thing. And if I transfer this now to the cross-cultural context, we want to see whether respondents in different countries have the same idea, the same meaning with items. And using web probing, we can uncover equivalence problems. And you just had the question, one of you, about quantizing the data. Because with web probings, you can ask many more respondents because it's a bit easier to implement. You get a higher number of responses. You can code these responses, and then you can usually also then have statistics on this, and you can see patterns. You have descriptives, and because of that, you see more clearly differences between different countries and cultures. So I said before, web surveys sound so easy, but you should still be sure that you implement that thoroughly. So to get any idea first how this works, so you have an item. How would you rate your health in general? Would you say your health is? That's your item that you are interested in, and you want to learn more about the response process of respondents. Typically on the next page. So first have respondents choose an answer, and typically on the next page, you can have an open-ended probe. And this is now similar to the kind of probing that I mentioned before. So when you answered the previous question about your health, what did you think of? And then respondents type in there, like, I was thinking about, I don't know, sports. I feel, excellent because I'm able to do a lot of sports, run the marathon. Or I was thinking about my disease or kind of COVID last week, things like that. So you get patterns, what respondents think of. You could develop a coding scheme. You could develop an error coding scheme, whatever, and then you can analyze the data. So at GASES, we often do the open-ended probes because it helps us to identify, just to get the pure respondent answers. There's also something that especially colleagues from some institutes in the United States have pioneered and tested, to ask closed probes. So in this case, when you answered the previous question about your health, what did you think of? And then, based on previous real cognitive interviewing data, so they used patterns they had in cognitive interviewing, they developed like answer option based on that. And that's what they give to the respondents, a closed probe. And then they want to find out, so what are the major things that respondents think of? Of course, it is not fully clear whether respondents really thought of these things or just see them here and then, oh yeah, that fits and that fits. So we have a paper on this, and we compared open-ended probe and closed-ended probe. And you can see that people also get triggered by the kind of options that they see here, and think after having answered the closed-ended question, yes, that could make sense as well. Very important, and that also applies to your study and to this project, to the Wisdom project. The way how you design the probes, how you, for instance, design the text box, gives a message to the respondents and tells them how much information they should enter. And so in this way, it's for you a decision. So am I just thinking about one, very short answer, a bullet point style, then it's going more smaller text box, or is it about a larger response, and then it's going to be a larger text box? Of course, maybe not too huge, because then they may be demotivated, but that's a very important thing. And there has also been research on that the text box sizes will trigger a certain amount and length of responses. So for instance, this was in one of the studies that we did, a lot of items about attitudes towards immigrants in different countries. So immigrants are generally good for America's economy, and we were interested in all the countries. So they translated these items, and they had different wordings, translations for immigrants. So what are the immigrants that respondents think of? Are these groups in some way comparable? So that was the research question here. And we used items from the International Social Survey Program, and then had this additional probe in a web service to see, are these groups comparable in one way or the other. That's this publication here, or here you, this is a category selection probe, also very popular, and actually respondents like to explain why they chose a certain answer. Not all respondents like to explain things, but in general, this please explain why you selected is working quite successfully. So here the item was one parent can bring up a child as well as two parents together. There were a lot of items on attitudes towards family and gender. And here we wanted to see, okay, why did respondents go for agree or disagree, etc. So my colleague had expectations here and theories, and we wanted to see whether this actually kind of gets confirmed by these answers. So if we talk about this web probing, especially in comparison to cognitive interviewing, there are certain strengths. So we have larger sample sizes, usually with a broader geographical coverage. Often you can buy these respondents from so-called online access panels that exist in a lot of countries, and they are kind of spread across the country. And you can imagine if you invite people personally to your cognitive lab or to another place, it's more kind of closer to you where you live. Or where the cognitive interviewers live. But if you've got this kind of web recruiting, you have a broader coverage. It could be important for your research question. It's a time and cost efficient recruitment because it's often through these online panel access panels, but also, of course, you may have your own mailing list, etc. And it's a relatively fast data collection. The mode, the strength, it's highly standardized because everyone gets the same items, exactly the same probe. There is no interview effect, so could kind of bring in some additional, reactions, and then the respondent gets shocked and maybe says something different. The nice thing is as well, there is no transcription of the interview data needed. Because remember, if you have cognitive interviewing in some way, you need to have to get from the interview to a transcription, to a recording, or to a summary, or whatever. Here, you already have all the answers in place. Coming back to the questions, because you have larger sample sizes, typically, you can, the findings, the themes, or the error types can be quantified. And that's nice, then you can better compare patterns. If you only have 10 respondents per country, and then comparing patterns is like, oh, 7 here and 8 there. Is that a difference or not? So these are the strengths of web probing. The strength for cross-cultural testing in particular, besides all these, is especially if you think about having cognitive interviewers or trained cognitive interviewers or finding those people who would be willing to do this. The nice thing is with web probing, you don't need cognitive interviewers. So it's essentially the web programming that does everything. And in terms of the analysis, what we found out also in research, that usually, especially in the cross-national context, and if you want to compare patterns of comprehension across countries, usually around 100 to 120 respondents per country language, or however you divide that, is sufficient to obtain a meaningful results, and also to have codings and compare these codings. So that's at least to give you an indication. If you do such web probing studies that help you to better understand your data, that's the kind of number per language or country, whatever, that you should or could aim for. Weaknesses as well, web probing. All the methods have their weaknesses and their strengths, and it's you who's going to decide what could be helpful for your research purposes. We don't have a motivating interviewer, so I don't have to tell you that writing text is more burdensome than just clicking an answer. So in a cognitive face-to-face interview, test persons come and they give answers. In the web mode, you will also get non-response answers. And depending on how, let's say, the quality policy of such a panel provider is, you may get even higher non-response answers. So for you as a researcher, that means you have really like the entire design, how you frame this, how you build your questionnaire, really also needs to make sense to the respondents so that they are willing to give answers to you. There's normally no spontaneous probing possible. It could be possible in cognitive interviewing because the cognitive interviewer sees a kind of, like, and I know suddenly the face gets, you beam, the test person beams or screams or whatever, and then the cognitive interviewer can act spontaneously. This is something you cannot do in web probing. And normally you only get whatever you get, and often there is no follow-up. But there are some methods how you can also follow up on incomplete answers, or you can program the web survey. If there's only one word, you can follow up on this. But normally it's you get one shot and that's the answer. In terms of response quality, as I said before, you have a higher probe non-response rate, and you also get mismatching answers. So it could be that you ask about the meaning of a term, and then the respondent nevertheless explains to you why he chose a certain answer, things like that. That's also later on a matter for you, how you build the entire kind of web probing questionnaire. Because we found out that if we had like 5 times they were supposed to explain their answer, and in the 6th time they were supposed to give us the meaning of a term, a lot of respondents didn't read that. They continued giving, explaining why they had chosen a certain answer. So all, you need to consider all at the same time, the number of probes, the type of probes, how am I going to construct this questionnaire as well. And it's great that you have larger sample sizes, because then you can get the patterns of errors, of themes, etc. But don't underestimate the time to also analyze this if you really want to thoroughly analyze web probing content as such. Weaknesses for cross-cultural testing is that you have the data, but you have also to think, okay, I have now my data in Japanese, in Portuguese, in English. Do I need a translation of the probes as well at some point in time? Or do we have country teams producing codings in the different languages? How are we going to analyze this? So here we have similar questions to cognitive interviewing. And here's a slide actually when it comes to if you have translations of these web probing answers. I can tell you actually from studies that we did here, machine translation is not too bad, but it depends on the language combinations. It definitely needs to be checked. And you should only use safe machine translations, so not the open source pipe where all the research data gets into, there is no data privacy anymore. So don't use DeepL as such. So it needs to be the safe and licensed version. But it's not too bad to get an idea of what is happening in different languages. And here was surprised, because often people do a lot of typos and, the sentence is not complete. It's just, sometimes it's a mess that they produce, but machine translation is getting better, depending on the language combination and on the topic. One example, and then I'm concluding with these examples from web probing, and then it's the final time for you to ask questions or to rest, and then we meet tomorrow at the same time again. So here's actually, we did the kind of testing after the official data collection, because in the International Social Survey Program, there were items of national identity. And statistically, we saw in our research team that things were not working for some countries. It was just a weird pattern that shouldn't be. So what we actually did in our research team, and also when we kind of tested all these web probing procedures, we took these items in their original source and translations from the International Social Survey Program, implemented them in web surveys, and asked additional web probing questions. How proud are you of country? So the country teams were supposed to add their country name with regard to its social security system. It was a whole battery of items. So how proud are you of the army of your country, of the literature of your country, of scientific achievements of your country, like 10 different things. And then also with regard to its social security system. And Mexico was also part of that, the ISSP 2013. I'm not going to read Spanish now, but this is for those of you who understand to read Spanish. a pretty literal translation of social security system. So social security system was meant in the sense of unemployment benefits, or like whatever the state helps, gives, like in terms of benefits or money to those in need. In the Mexican context, in the ISSP, but luckily also in our web probing study, we could replicate this peculiar answer pattern, and then we found out. So we asked people, so what kind of benefits, social security, what aspects of the social security system have you been thinking of when you answered this item? So this was our probe. And 39% of our web probing respondents, so also we had like even 200 respondents per country, 39% of Mexican respondents were thinking about the security situation on the streets, which had nothing to do with the social security system as intended by the item. And that was something very nice, I would say, not the issue itself or the problem was nice, but that we were able to uncover such misunderstandings using the kind of data that we got from the web probing study. Final slide for you, and then it's almost 6 on my side. I don't know how, like noon, I guess, for some of you. If you're asking now, so what kind of answers, what's the length of answers that you may get? So this is, for instance, also we asked about satisfaction of democracy, typical item that is asked for a political scientist in a lot of cross-national studies. And then we asked respondents, okay, first they had identified them, I'm very satisfied or extremely satisfied with the way how democracy works. And then we asked them, please give reasons for your answer. And we repeated on the design, this was the item, this was the answer, and now please tell us, why did you choose this? And the idea was, so across countries, are they thinking about the same dimensions, like in terms of output or in terms of the political system? So what are the kind of dimensions that respondents across different countries think of when they talk about satisfaction or dissatisfaction with democracy? And this is just an Excel output for you. Here you see, for instance, you have respondents like -66 is the code for non-response. So they just skipped the item. You have very short answers, still needs work. And then you have longer answers. Once again, this depends on our text box size. But for these kind of category selection probes, we had larger text box sizes, like 5 centimeters or so. And with this, actually, then we developed coding schemes. We were able to quantify, okay, what kind of dimensions of democracy are the respondents in different countries think of. And with this, on the slides, you will also find hands-on guidelines on web probing, on cognitive interviewing, if you would like to implement those. But I think I would now like to conclude and ask whether there are any final questions from you, final comments from you. I know this was now a lot. I've been speaking for 2 hours and 50 minutes, a lot of words, a lot of input.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but just in case, I have my own question. I can probably start with it while others thinking. Is there any difference for the open-ended questions when you do, like in our case, in our first study, we have the most important part of this first questionnaire are open-ended questions. So when we do this web probing and we're about to launch it in Canada, is there some specifics, or does it even make sense to ask open-ended questions about the open-ended questions?
I think it's more that you want to make sure that the open-ended questions that you ask are correctly understood. So I think that's more. So you could imagine that you have, I don't know, maybe a face-to-face cognitive interview. And I think that you already had this in your plan, like 10 interviews. At least if the people get your question and you ask them, so, okay, now you're reading this, okay, I'm supposed to give some more details and whatever. You need to make sure that these questions are correctly understood. And I think for you, it's also a matter if you're going to implement these questions online, how are you going to implement this? Are they all going to be on one screen and respondents may be shocked maybe? Or how are you going to, like, because these are going to be 6 open-ended questions or 7 open-ended questions, or at least from your draft. So you have to see what is also kind of still motivating for respondents. Are we going to have one question after the other, or 6 on one screen? So I think this is something that you could test as well in the cognitive interviewing study. Does this answer your question? No, sorry, but
Yeah, it sort of does. So yeah, I can see it as a yes.
yeah.
It
But
makes
let's
sense.
say the same design principles in terms of, let's say, the text box size is important for you. What applies to cognitive interviewing, this applies to your open-ended questions as well. What I said at the beginning, that your questions need to be clear, or if you refer in some of your open-ended questions back to a prior answer that they had given, then it makes sense to apply some of the principles from web probing as well, which is, for instance, provide some prior information if you base your probe on that, so that respondents know what you're talking about. It could be that, for instance, you ask in the first question, so in your life, what has been a significant challenge? And maybe respondents are supposed to say one thing. Let's say buying a house, right? And they enter this into a text box. And at this stage, it's a text box. You could then use a placeholder to pipe this answer onto the next pages. And now we're talking about this answer, which was colon placeholder buying a house. And then now we ask you all these additional questions. So these are some principles from cognitive, from web probing that could apply to your open-ended questionnaire as well. But I'm very happy to ask some more concrete questions also at the next sessions that we have later on, like these 1-hour sessions.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have to move on.
Yes, I think this has been great. Thank you so much, Dorothy, for joining us today. And we'll continue again tomorrow, same time, same link. Please stay tuned. And we will also be broadcasting live on YouTube. So there will be another announcement, which we have done right now as well. So looking forward to more questions. And as I mentioned before, we will also have the link for the recording available to the participants after the session. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Take care.
Thank you.